Imagine working for a boss so intimidating that entire conversations shrink into whispers the moment she steps into a room. That was my life for an entire year at Clark Industries, a place where ambition thrived, mistakes were remembered, and excellence was the only acceptable standard. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Clark, a woman whose presence alone could silence a room without a single word. She wasn't loud, she didn't need to be. Authority followed her like a shadow, woven into every measured step, every precise glance, every perfectly chosen word. People didn't just respect her, they adjusted themselves around her, like gravity had subtly shifted in her direction. For the longest time, I believed I understood her. I had reduced her to a set of traits that made sense: disciplined, distant, brilliant, and emotionally impenetrable. It made her easier to work for that way, easier to categorize. Until one moment, one single word, quietly spoken, unraveled everything I thought I knew. That moment didn't feel important when the day began. The morning had started like all the others. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I walked down the long corridor toward my desk. The sound so constant it had become part of the building's identity. My heels tapped against the polished floor in a rhythm I had unconsciously matched to the pace of my routine. Everything about my mornings had become precise, predictable, controlled. I had been working at Clark Industries for 1 year, 2 months, and 16 days. I told myself I wasn't counting, but the number lived in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Time felt different when you worked for someone like Evelyn Clark. Days didn't blur together, they stacked, one on top of another, each carrying weight. Some people collected hobbies, souvenirs, or milestones. I collected moments, small observations, glances, reactions, pieces of a person who revealed almost nothing of herself. Behind her back, people called her the Ice Queen. The nickname traveled in hushed tones, carried carefully from one cubicle to another, never spoken loudly enough to risk consequence. It wasn't entirely unfair. I had watched confident, seasoned professionals stumble over their own words under her gaze. I had seen presentations unravel not because they were flawed, but because the person delivering them lost their composure the second she leaned back in her chair and simply looked at them. There was something about her stillness. It wasn't passive. It was deliberate, controlled, almost surgical. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fidget. She listened, and somehow that made everything more intense. I remembered my first day with painful clarity. I had been 25, freshly graduated, armed with qualifications that suddenly felt very small as I sat outside her office. My hands had been shaking despite my efforts to keep them still, fingers tightly interlaced in my lap. The receptionist, Margaret, had glanced at me more than once, offering quiet, sympathetic looks that only made my nerves worse. It had felt less like waiting for an interview and more like waiting for judgment. Then the door opened. Evelyn Clark stepped out with a presence that seemed to alter the space itself. She wore a charcoal gray suit, sharp and immaculate, every line intentional. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek bun that revealed the full intensity of her expression. She wasn't towering, but she carried herself in a way that made her seem taller, more commanding. Her eyes were what struck me the most, green, sharp, observant. They didn't just look at you, they assessed you, as if measuring something invisible beneath the surface. When she said my name, her voice was calm and precise, edged with something that felt like quiet curiosity. I reacted too quickly, standing so abruptly that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound echoed in the silence, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. She didn't react, not even a flicker of amusement. She simply turned and instructed me to follow. The interview itself lasted 12 minutes. I knew because I kept glancing at the antique clock on her desk, its elegant design so out of place in the otherwise modern office that it became an anchor for my attention. Each second felt stretched, magnified under the weight of her focus. She asked the expected questions, but there was nothing casual about the way she asked them. Every word felt deliberate, every pause intentional. It wasn't just what I said that mattered. It was how I said it, how quickly I responded, how confidently I held her gaze. What unsettled me the most was the way she listened. She gave me her full attention in a way I had never experienced before. No phone, no distractions, no shifting focus. When I spoke about my ideas, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on me with unwavering intensity. It was validating in a way that felt almost overwhelming, like being seen too clearly. When the interview ended, there was no dramatic conclusion. No smile, no reassurance, just a nod, a brief acknowledgement, and a dismissal. I got the job. Working for her became an exercise in observation and interpretation. She was consistent, but not predictable in the ways that mattered. She expected excellence without needing to say it repeatedly. She noticed everything, and forgetting that even once was enough to learn the lesson permanently. Yet, beneath that controlled exterior, there were moments, brief, fleeting cracks where something else showed through. One of those moments happened during a company event when an employee's young daughter wandered into Evelyn's office. The entire floor had gone into a quiet panic, anticipating the worst. Interrupting Evelyn Clark was not something anyone did lightly. When I found them, the scene was nothing like I expected. Evelyn was crouched down, perfectly composed, listening intently as the child described a drawing with animated excitement. There was no impatience in her posture, no irritation in her expression. Instead, there was something startlingly gentle in the way she nodded along, as if the story being told mattered. Then she smiled. It wasn't polite or restrained. It was real, warm, and completely transformative. For that brief moment, she looked like a different person, someone unguarded, someone human in a way I hadn't thought possible. And then it was gone. She noticed me, stood up smoothly, and the familiar composure returned as if it had never left. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. After that, I began noticing more. Her routines were precise, almost ritualistic. She arrived at exactly the same time every morning, carrying the same coffee, black and unaltered. She read multiple newspapers with focused efficiency, absorbing information faster than seemed possible. She recalled details from conversations weeks later, referencing them with accuracy that left people quietly stunned. But it was the smaller things that fascinated me. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when deep in thought. The quiet habit of keeping a small plant on her windowsill, something alive and soft in an otherwise sharp, structured environment. The way she occasionally spoke to it under her breath when she believed herself to be alone. There was a particular moment every afternoon when the sunlight shifted just enough to change her entire office. The light softened the angles, warmed the space, and for a few minutes, she seemed less like a figure of authority and more like a person simply existing within it. Those were the moments I found hardest to ignore. I told myself it was admiration, professional respect, nothing more, because anything beyond that would have been complicated, inappropriate, dangerous even, not just for my career, but for the fragile balance I had built around understanding her. And yet the truth was harder to admit. She intrigued me in a way no one else ever had. She had built something extraordinary, broken barriers, commanded respect in a world that didn't easily offer it. And still, she seemed alone within it. There were no casual mentions of friends, no stories of family, no glimpses into a life beyond the office walls. Sometimes, long after everyone else had left, I would notice the light still on in her office. She worked late not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something that looked a lot like necessity. From my desk I had a clear view of her door, and over time, I developed a habit of noticing her movements. The rhythm of her day, the subtle changes in her pace, the rare moments when she paused, just briefly, as if collecting her thoughts before continuing. It wasn't intentional at first. It became something else over time, familiar, and then there were the details I shouldn't have noticed at all. The faint trace of her perfume as she passed by, something subtle and refined that lingered just long enough to be remembered. The way her presence seemed to leave an imprint, even after she was gone. I told myself to stop paying attention to those things. I didn't. Despite everything people said about her, she had never treated me unfairly. She demanded precision, but she also trusted me. She gave me responsibilities that mattered, listened when I spoke, and never dismissed my ideas without consideration. That trust meant more than I was willing to admit. It made me want to do better, to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, to be someone she could rely on without hesitation. So I stayed late. I volunteered for extra work. I memorized her preferences without being asked. I told myself it was professionalism. It wasn't entirely true, because beneath all of it there was something else forming quietly, steadily, without permission, and I ignored it. Until the morning everything changed. That day began like every other. I arrived early, prepared everything down to the smallest detail, and settled into the rhythm I had perfected over time. At 9, Lena Morrison arrived, bringing with her a kind of energy that didn't belong in that building but somehow made it feel more alive. She moved through the office with effortless warmth, her presence a sharp contrast to the controlled atmosphere around us. Where Evelyn was measured, Lena was expressive. Where Evelyn was restrained, Lena was open. The two worlds collided that morning in ways I hadn't anticipated. And somewhere between routine and disruption, between control and unpredictability, something shifted. It didn't happen loudly. It happened in a single moment, carried by a single word, and nothing felt the same after that. I took careful notes as Lena spoke, my pen moving steadily across the page while I tried to stay focused on the details of her presentation. Every so often, I felt her gaze drift toward me, and when I looked up, I caught her watching me with a soft, knowing expression that made something in my chest tighten with discomfort. It wasn't judgmental, just observant in a way that felt a little too personal for a professional setting. When we paused for coffee, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The structured tone of the meeting dissolved into something more relaxed, more familiar. Lena leaned closer across the table, lowering her voice just enough to create the illusion of secrecy, even though there was no one close enough to overhear. She brought up Evelyn with an almost playful curiosity, her tone light but deliberate. The way she spoke made it clear she had already formed her own impressions, shaped more by my reactions than by any actual interaction. Heat crept up the back of my neck as I tried to respond carefully, keeping my voice even and controlled. I described Evelyn in the safest terms I could manage, emphasizing her professionalism, her focus, her undeniable competence. Lena didn't look convinced. There was a spark of mischief in her eyes, something sharp and perceptive that made me feel like I had already revealed more than I intended. The conversation shifted subtly, and before I could redirect it, she had crossed into territory I wasn't prepared to navigate. The implication in her words landed heavily, catching me off guard in a way that made my reaction immediate and defensive. I lowered my voice instinctively, glancing around to make sure no one was paying attention. The last thing I needed was for something like that to be overheard in an office like this. Lena, however, remained completely at ease, her amusement obvious, her confidence unshaken. She brushed off my reaction with effortless certainty, as if the conclusion she had reached about me was already decided and beyond argument. She had known me for years, long enough to recognize patterns I had never fully acknowledged myself. According to her, there was a certain expression I wore when I was interested in someone, something subtle but unmistakable. She insisted she had seen it before, that it had been there every time I spoke about Evelyn. The claim made my stomach drop. I denied it immediately, too quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. The denial felt weak even as I said it. Lena only smiled wider, entirely unconvinced. She drew a comparison to someone from our past, a professor I had admired years ago, someone who had shared a similar presence, intelligent, composed, slightly intimidating. The parallel hit closer than I wanted to admit. I tried to argue that the situations were completely different, but my voice betrayed me, rising just enough to give away my uncertainty. Lena reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently, her expression softening in a way that replaced teasing with something more sincere. There was no judgment in her words then, only reassurance. She spoke about attraction with an easy acceptance, framing it as something natural rather than something to be hidden or denied. Her tone carried warmth, but it also left me with a quiet unease, as if she had named something I wasn't ready to face. The meeting wrapped up not long after, the return to business almost abrupt after the shift in conversation. By the time we finished, it was late morning, and I walked Lena toward the elevators, grateful for the distraction of her usual storytelling. She slipped easily into a description of her latest dating disaster, something complicated and absurd involving a woman with unusual hobbies and very strong opinions about things most people never thought twice about. Her animated retelling pulled laughter out of me despite the lingering tension in my thoughts. For a few moments, everything felt normal again, light and familiar in a way the office rarely allowed. We stood in the wide hallway near the elevators, still caught in the rhythm of that conversation when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression brightening as she announced that her ride had arrived. She turned toward me with her usual warmth, stepping in for a goodbye that felt as effortless as everything else about her. Her arms wrapped around me in a quick, familiar embrace, and as she pulled back, she spoke with the same affectionate ease she used with everyone in her life. The word she chose was simple, casual, something she used so often it had almost no weight coming from her. And yet, in that moment, it changed everything. As it left her lips, my attention shifted without warning. Movement in the corner of my vision drew my focus, and I turned just enough to see a figure approaching from the executive wing. The stride was unmistakable, controlled and purposeful in a way I had come to recognize instantly. Evelyn. She was close enough to hear, far enough that I couldn't immediately rate her expression. A stack of files rested in her arms, her posture aligned with the expectation of her next meeting, her focus clearly directed toward the conference room ahead. Then she stopped. Not a hesitation or a slowed step, but a complete stop, as if something had interrupted her momentum entirely. Her gaze shifted, moving from Lena to me and back again. For a brief moment, the careful control she maintained so effortlessly seemed to falter. Something unfamiliar surfaced in her expression, something that didn't belong to the composed version of her I knew so well. It looked like confusion, though it carried an edge of something deeper, something harder to define. Lena remained completely unaware of the shift in the atmosphere. She gave me one last squeeze, her attention already moving forward as she stepped toward the elevator, calling out a casual goodbye that echoed faintly in the open space. I responded automatically, but my focus had already narrowed entirely on Evelyn. She stood there, still and silent, as if the world around her had paused. The distance between us felt strangely charged, stretched by something unspoken. For a few seconds that felt far longer than they were, we simply looked at each other. I tried to find something to say, anything that might bridge the sudden tension, but no words came. Before I could gather my thoughts, she seemed to pull herself back together. The shift was immediate, her shoulders straightened, her posture resetting into its usual precision. The expression disappeared so quickly it was almost disorienting, replaced by the familiar mask of control. Without a word, she walked past me, her heels striking the floor with sharp, measured rhythm. But in that brief instant before she recovered, I had seen it. Something raw, something unguarded, something that looked dangerously close to jealousy. The thought felt impossible the moment it formed. It didn't align with anything I knew about her, with the image she projected or the way she carried herself. Someone like Evelyn Clark didn't react to casual moments like that. She didn't let something so small affect her, and yet the image stayed with me. I remained in the hallway long after she disappeared, the silence settling around me as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. It would have been easier to dismiss it, to convince myself I had imagined it or misread the situation entirely. But the more I replayed it in my mind, the less convincing that explanation felt. The rest of the day unfolded in a strange haze. I returned to my desk and attempted to focus on my work, but my concentration fractured repeatedly. The moment in the hallway replayed over and over, each detail sharpening instead of fading. The way she had stopped, the flicker of emotion, the speed of her recovery. I found myself rereading the same email multiple times without absorbing a single word. Eventually, I gave up and redirected my energy into something mindless, organizing my desk supplies with unnecessary precision. There was a strange comfort in the simplicity of it, in the ability to control something small when everything else felt uncertain. Her board meeting ran longer than expected, though that in itself wasn't unusual. These meetings often stretched on, especially when important projections were being discussed. Still, I caught myself glancing toward the conference room more often than necessary, my attention drifting despite my efforts to remain focused. When the doors finally opened, the board members filed out with the composed efficiency of people accustomed to authority. They looked satisfied, if slightly worn down by the length of the discussion. I recognized them all by now, their presence a familiar part of the company's rhythm. Evelyn emerged last. Something about her was different. It wasn't obvious at first glance. To anyone else, she likely appeared exactly the same, composed, controlled, entirely self-assured. But after a year of observing her, I noticed the subtle shifts. The absence of that quiet post-meeting confidence she usually carried. The tension held just beneath the surface. She walked past my desk without acknowledgement, which wasn't unusual, but her posture felt tighter than normal. Her grip on her portfolio was firm, almost rigid, as if she were holding on to something more than just documents. I waited before approaching her office, giving her the time that professional boundaries required. When I finally knocked, her response came quickly, her tone steady but carrying something faintly strained beneath it. Inside, she stood by the window, her back to the door, looking out over the city. Her jacket was gone, revealing a softer layer beneath the structured exterior, though it didn't make her seem any less distant. She began speaking immediately, addressing work matters with her usual efficiency, outlining revisions that needed to be made and instructions that required no clarification. I responded automatically, slipping into the familiar rhythm of my role, noting each detail with practiced precision. Then she mentioned canceling a dinner. The request caught me off guard. The meeting in question had been important, something she had been preparing for with unusual attention. I hesitated just briefly, before confirming the instruction. The shift in her tone when she repeated it made it clear the decision was final. There was something in her expression when I looked up, something intense and unreadable that made the air between us feel heavier. I asked for clarification carefully, but the response came sharper than expected before softening almost immediately, as if she had caught herself. I noted the instruction anyway, though my thoughts were already racing. The conversation should have ended there, but it didn't. She brought up Lena. The question seemed simple on the surface, but the way she asked it carried weight. I felt it immediately, the subtle tension beneath the words. I answered honestly, explaining our history, our friendship, the years that connected us. She listened, but her attention shifted in small, restless ways. Papers that were already perfectly aligned were adjusted again, her movements precise but unnecessary. When I asked why she wanted to know, her explanation came quickly, but it lacked conviction. Even she seemed aware of how unconvincing it sounded. The dismissal that followed was clear. I should have left. Instead, I hesitated. Her name left my mouth before I could stop it, the familiarity of it breaking the usual boundary between us. The reaction it triggered was immediate, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. I asked if she was all right. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression. The mask slipped, revealing something softer, something unguarded that looked almost like longing. Then it was gone. She straightened slightly, her composure returning as smoothly as ever. Her voice, when she responded, was steady and controlled, leaving no room for further questions. She was fine. And just like that, the distance between us was firmly back in place. I nodded and turned toward the door, ready to leave, ready to put distance between myself and everything that felt too complicated to name. My hand had just closed around the handle when her voice stopped me. She said my name in a way that felt different, quieter, almost uncertain. I turned back, my pulse already unsteady, and found her watching me with an intensity that hadn't quite settled back into its usual control. There was a pause before she spoke again, as if she were choosing her words with unusual care. She mentioned the word Lena had used earlier. That single, casual endearment that had meant nothing at the time suddenly carried weight in the way she said it. Her voice held a subtle tension, something restrained but unmistakable. My grip tightened on the handle as I explained, keeping my tone even, that it was normal for Lena, that she spoke that way with everyone, that it was simply part of her personality, nothing exclusive, nothing meaningful. Evelyn repeated the idea quietly, as if testing it, turning it over in her mind. The shift in her expression was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A faint easing, a release of something she had been holding on to. Relief. It was subtle enough to miss if I hadn't been watching her so closely for so long. I left her office with my thoughts in disarray, the pieces of everything that had happened beginning to align in a way that felt both impossible and undeniable. The cancelled dinner, the questions about Lena, the way she had stopped in the hallway as if something had struck her mid-step. It all traced back to that moment, to that one word that had somehow unsettled the most composed person I had ever known. The idea that formed from it felt absurd. It didn't belong in the reality I understood. Evelyn Clark, controlled to the point of near perfection, did not lose her composure over something so small. She did not react emotionally to casual affection between friends, and yet her behavior said otherwise. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments of concentration broken by distraction. I tried to immerse myself in the Harrison revisions, but my attention refused to stay where I placed it. My thoughts kept circling back, drawn again and again to her office door. Every movement caught my attention. Every time it opened, every glimpse of her inside, something in me responded before I could stop it. It was subtle, a slight quickening, a shift in awareness that made it impossible to fully focus on anything else. By early evening, the office had begun to empty. The usual noise faded into a quiet hum, desks abandoned, lights dimmed. Still, the light in her office remained on. I finished my work slowly, delaying without fully acknowledging why. When everything was done, I gathered my things, stood and hesitated. Then I made a decision that felt small in action but significant in intention. Instead of leaving, I walked to the kitchen and prepared a fresh cup of coffee exactly the way she liked it. Black, no sugar, no cream. Simple, precise, familiar. When I brought it to her later that evening, she looked genuinely surprised to see me still there. The coffee sat between us as we discussed work, but the conversation carried an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. It felt less structured, less defined by roles, as if something had shifted slightly out of alignment. At one point our hands brushed when she returned a set of files. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact was brief, almost insignificant, but it lingered in a way that felt disproportionate to the moment itself. I told myself it meant nothing. I didn't believe it. By the time I left, that small moment had settled into my thoughts with quiet persistence, keeping me awake longer than it should have as I turned it over again and again, searching for meaning where there might have been none. The next morning arrived with a storm that turned the city gray and restless. Rain fell hard enough to blur the streets into motion and noise, and despite my umbrella, I arrived at the office soaked through, my carefully chosen outfit clinging uncomfortably, my composure less polished than usual. Margaret noticed immediately. The expression on her face carried a mix of concern and urgency, the kind that suggested something had already gone wrong. She leaned closer as I approached, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, as if sharing something she shouldn't. She told me Evelyn had been asking about me repeatedly since early morning, checking the time, pacing something completely out of character. The image alone was enough to unsettle me. Evelyn did not pace. She did not lose control of her time or her composure. The mention of her muttering about boundaries and something inappropriate made my stomach drop further. I tried to stay calm as I moved to my desk, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. My work had been flawless. Everything had been completed on time, exactly as requested. There was no professional reason for concern. That reassurance lasted only until my computer chimed. The message waiting in my inbox was brief, direct, and unmistakably hers. A request to come to her office immediately, stripped of any formality beyond the bare minimum. It felt less like a request and more like a summons. I grabbed my notepad, smoothing my damp hair with nervous hands as I made my way toward her office. Through the glass, I could see her standing by the window, her back turned, her posture rigid against the backdrop of the storm outside. I knocked, waited, and entered when instructed, closing the door behind me at her request. The sound of it shutting seemed louder than it should have been, sealing the space in a way that heightened the tension already present. The silence stretched. Rain tapped insistently against the windows, thunder rolling faintly in the distance, filling the space between us until she finally turned. The sight of her caught me off guard. She looked tired, not in a way most people would notice, but enough that it stood out to me. The faint shadows beneath her eyes, the slight strain in her posture, the subtle absence of her usual sharpness. She asked me to sit. I did, perching on the edge of the chair, my notepad held tightly in my hands, something to anchor myself. She remained standing for a moment longer before moving behind her desk, though even then, she didn't immediately settle into her usual composure. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but there was something deliberate about it, as if she had practiced the words before saying them. She apologized. The statement alone was enough to shift the ground beneath me. She described her behavior from the previous day as inappropriate, unprofessional. The words felt formal, but the meaning behind them was anything but. I tried to deflect, to soften it, offering an explanation that framed it as work-related, something procedural and harmless. She dismissed that immediately. The sound she made carried a trace of something strained, something closer to frustration than amusement. She acknowledged what had happened without hiding behind excuses, and the honesty of it made the moment heavier. She asked me to let her finish. Then she said it. What she had felt in that hallway in that moment had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. The boundary between employer and employee had blurred in a way she could not justify, could not allow. The phrase she used settled heavily in my mind. Personal feelings. Everything seemed to narrow around those words. She continued, her tone shifting back towards something more structured, more distant, as if retreating into the version of herself that felt safest. She explained that she had already taken steps to resolve the situation, that arrangements were being made to transfer me to another department. The offer was framed as an opportunity, a promotion and improvement. It felt like distance, like removal, like losing something I hadn't fully realized I was holding on to. The impact of it hit harder than I expected. I repeated the idea aloud, needing to hear it clearly, to understand it fully. She avoided my gaze as she explained it was the best course of action, that the situation had become complicated in a way that wasn't fair to me. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the person in front of me with everything that had happened in the past 2 days. The shift felt too sudden, too absolute. The refusal came before I could overthink it. I didn't want to leave. The words carried more force than I intended, driven by something deeper than logic. I tried to explain it in practical terms, focusing on the work, the challenges, the role itself. But that wasn't the full truth, so I said the rest. I liked working for her. The admission changed something in her expression. It was brief, almost hidden, but it was there. A flicker of something that looked like hope before it was quickly suppressed. She tried to explain the position it placed her in, the complication, the conflict. But I had already reached the conclusion she hadn't fully voiced. I said it. The word fell into the space between us with a clarity that left no room for avoidance. Jealousy. Everything stilled. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. The reaction unfolded slowly across her face, moving through surprise, resistance, and finally something quieter. Something that looked like reluctant acceptance of a truth she could no longer deny. Yes. She admitted at last, her voice barely above a whisper, stripped of its usual control. The word carried weight, fragile and unguarded. She spoke of a jealousy that made no sense even to her. Something irrational and immediate, sparked by a person she didn't know and a word that had never belonged to her. The thought unsettled her, and she tried to dismiss it almost as quickly as she had confessed it, shaking her head as if to push it away. She retreated into logic, into structure, into the rules she had built her life around. This was exactly why things had to change, why distance was necessary, why the situation could not be allowed to continue. Her voice regained some of its firmness as she spoke of professionalism, of boundaries that should never have blurred. I didn't step back. Instead, I spoke quietly, but with a certainty that surprised even me. The idea that this was wrong, that it needed to be erased, didn't feel true anymore. Not after everything that had already surfaced between us. She looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to understand what I was saying beneath the words themselves. The truth came out slowly at first, then all at once. I admitted the things I had kept buried for months, the observations I had pretended were insignificant, the attention I had justified as nothing more than dedication to my work. I spoke about the way I noticed her, the way I anticipated her, the way my focus shifted whenever she entered a room. I spoke about how much our conversations meant, how they lingered with me long after they ended. And then I said the part I had never allowed myself to think too clearly about. That moment in the hallway had not only affected her, it had affected me too. Hearing that word had stirred something sharp and unexpected, not because of what it meant, but because of who it hadn't come from. The realization had settled in with a clarity I could no longer ignore. The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched between us, charged and fragile, filled with everything neither of us had been willing to acknowledge before. My heartbeat felt impossibly loud, each second amplifying the weight of what I had just said. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows, rain and thunder filling the world beyond her office. Inside, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had paused to wait for what would happen next. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, less certain than I had ever heard it. She insisted I didn't understand, but the words lacked conviction. The certainty she usually carried wasn't there. It had been replaced by something more vulnerable, something uncertain. I held onto my ground. I told her I understood exactly what I was saying, that whatever had shifted between us was not one-sided, not imagined, not something that could be dismissed so easily. The change had been real and it had been shared. She moved then abruptly, turning away from me and returning to the windows as if distance might restore her balance. Her reflection in the glass looked different, less composed, almost fragile under the dim light and the movement of the storm outside. She spoke about reality, about the differences between us that could not be ignored. My age, my future, the open possibilities ahead of me. Her own life, already defined, already structured around choices she had made and responsibilities she carried. And above all, the fact that she was my boss, a boundary that complicated everything beyond repair. Her words were steady, but the tension beneath them betrayed the conflict she was trying to contain. I stood as well, closing some of the distance between us, refusing to let those arguments end the conversation. The differences she named felt real, but not insurmountable. What mattered more was what had already taken root between us, something neither of us had planned and neither of us could easily undo. She turned back slowly, and the struggle within her became visible in a way it never had before. Control and restraint pulling against something far less predictable. The version of her that had always been untouchable now stood in quiet conflict with something deeply human. She repeated the idea of feeling as if testing it, as if unsure whether to accept it or reject it. When she asked how I felt, the question carried a vulnerability that made everything else fall away. There was no room left for hesitation. I told her the truth. That being around her had felt like holding something in, something unspoken that had been building over time. That every conversation carried weight, that the smallest moments stayed with me longer than they should. That when she allowed herself even the slightest softness, it changed everything. She closed her eyes briefly as if absorbing the words was almost too much. I kept going. I spoke about the details I had noticed, the habits she likely believed went unseen. The small human moments that existed beneath her carefully maintained exterior. The way she revealed herself without meaning to. Her reaction was immediate, surprise breaking through her composure, a faint color rising that she couldn't entirely hide. The realization that she had been seen, truly seen, unsettled her in a way that nothing else seemed to. I stepped closer, the space between us narrowing without either of us fully deciding to move. I spoke about the way she spoke to me. The difference in her tone, the subtle shifts that set me apart from everyone else. It wasn't imagined. It was real, and it had been there all along. She tried to interrupt, to regain control of the conversation, but the words faltered before they fully formed. The certainty she relied on was slipping, replaced by something far less stable. I told her what she had become to me. Someone who both unsettled and drew me in. Someone whose strength and intelligence commanded admiration, but whose hidden kindness made that admiration deepen into something else entirely. Someone who existed behind walls she had built carefully over time, walls that now felt less solid than they once had. By then, the distance between us had nearly disappeared. Her breathing had changed faster, less controlled, mirroring the tension that filled the room. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost unsteady, as she admitted what she had felt in that moment. The experience had been overwhelming, unfamiliar, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. It had been sharp and immediate, cutting through the control she depended on. She described it not with ease, but with honesty. The intensity of it had frightened her, because everything she had built, her discipline, her boundaries, her distance, depended on maintaining control. And whatever this was, whatever existed between us, threatened to undo that carefully constructed balance. She looked at me then with a kind of intensity that felt deeper than anything she had shown before. Being around me made her want to let go of that control. The admission settled heavily between us. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the rain striking the glass with renewed force, isolating us further from the rest of the world. The space between us felt smaller, more intimate, shaped by everything we had just laid bare. I spoke softly, acknowledging the fear rather than dismissing it. Some things were meant to be uncertain, meant to challenge the structures people built around themselves. Not everything valuable came without risk. She tried to argue, to bring the conversation back to practical consequences. The potential for gossip, for misunderstandings, for assumptions that could undermine everything we had worked for. I didn't let those fears define the moment. I knew what I had accomplished, what I was capable of. My work stood on its own, independent of anything else. What others might think didn't change that truth. She studied me in silence, as if weighing every word, every possibility. Then she revealed something else. Something that shifted everything again. Her feelings hadn't started recently. They had been there from the beginning, quietly growing beneath the surface, hidden behind the same control she applied to everything else in her life. She spoke about a moment early on, one she remembered clearly, when something about me had stood out in a way she hadn't been able to ignore. The admission carried a mixture of frustration and reluctant honesty. She had recognized the danger immediately. And still, she had done nothing to stop it. Hearing that changed something inside me, replacing uncertainty with something warmer, something more certain. The time we had both spent pretending now felt visible, shared in ways neither of us had acknowledged before. The understanding settled between us without needing to be spoken. She reached toward me slowly, her movement deliberate, giving me the space to pull away if I wanted to. I didn't. Her hand brushed lightly against my hair, the contact gentle but charged with everything that had led up to it. The sensation sent a quiet shiver through me, grounding the moment in something real, something undeniable. She called it reckless, something beyond reason, but she didn't move away. I responded without thinking, the words slipping out before I could filter them. The meaning behind them lingered even after I felt the heat rise to my face. She didn't let me take them back. The space between us narrowed further, filled with a tension that felt both fragile and inevitable. The air seemed heavier, every movement more deliberate, every breath more noticeable. When she said my name, it sounded different, softer, carrying something deeper than formality. She made it clear that crossing this line would change everything. There would be no return to what we had been before. I understood that completely, and I chose it anyway. The moment that followed didn't unfold dramatically. Instead, reality interrupted in the smallest, most practical way. The setting, the visibility, the reminder that we were still standing in a place defined by structure and observation. She stepped back, the awareness of our surroundings returning all at once. The shift didn't erase what had happened, but it forced us to pause, to reconsider where we stood. I acknowledged it, though my pulse still carried the echo of everything that had just passed between us. What we had said, what we had admitted, couldn't be undone or ignored. She agreed. The need for privacy, for space to fully understand what this meant, became clear. The conversation we had started required more than a few stolen moments in an office filled with unspoken rules. When I suggested continuing somewhere else, the boldness of it caught up with me immediately, but I didn't take it back. For the first time in days, something lighter touched her expression. A real smile, small but unmistakable. The shift in her demeanor was subtle but significant, as if something inside her had finally begun to settle. She decided quickly after that, with a clarity that replaced hesitation. She turned back to her desk and began reshaping her day. Meetings were moved. Responsibilities reassigned, priorities adjusted with the same efficiency she applied to everything. Only this time, the reason was different. For once, she was choosing something outside of work, and that choice changed everything. "Dear," she said with quiet satisfaction, as if she had just closed a deal rather than rearranged her entire day. The shift was immediate and absolute. In a matter of minutes, the carefully structured schedule that usually dictated every hour of her life had been cleared, pushed aside with decisive efficiency. She stood, reaching for her purse with a sense of purpose that felt different from the version of her I had come to know. There was a lightness in her movements, something unrestrained, almost unfamiliar. She told me she wanted to show me something. Not the version of herself the world saw, not the polished executive defined by control and precision, but something more real. Something that existed beyond boardrooms and expectations. The drive that followed felt surreal. I sat beside her as the city blurred past, watching the steady focus in her expression as she navigated the streets. She drove the way she did everything else, with quiet intensity, completely present in the moment. She offered very little explanation, only enough to make it clear that whatever she was about to show me mattered. We left behind the familiar corporate landscape, moving into a part of the city I didn't recognize. The buildings grew smaller, less polished, more lived in. When she finally pulled into a modest parking lot, I found myself staring at a building that stood in stark contrast to everything I associated with her world. It was simple, painted in a warm yellow that stood out against the gray sky. A small garden stretched out front, filled with volunteers tending to vegetables and flowers, their laughter carrying lightly through the air. She stepped out of the car with quiet confidence, retrieving a worn bag from the trunk, something practical and unassuming. The setting didn't fit the image of her I had built over the past year, and the disconnect left me momentarily speechless. She explained it simply. This was a place she came to regularly, a part of her life she had kept entirely separate from everything else. For years, she had spent her weekends here, teaching, guiding, helping people build something for themselves. The revelation shifted something in me instantly. This wasn't the woman people whispered about in corporate hallways. This wasn't the untouchable figure defined by control and distance. This was someone who chose consistently and quietly to give her time and energy to something that had nothing to do with profit or recognition. When I asked why I had never heard about it, her answer was soft, almost private. Because it belonged only to her. In a world where everything she did was analyzed, scrutinized, turned into headlines and expectations, this was the one place where she existed without performance. Here, she wasn't a title or a reputation. She was simply herself. Inside, the atmosphere wrapped around us immediately. The space was warm, alive with movement and voices. Walls covered in children's drawings, rooms filled with activity, the hum of people learning, creating, building something meaningful. And then there was the way people greeted her, not with fear or formality, but with familiarity and genuine warmth. She responded in kind, her voice softer, her posture less rigid, her entire presence shifting into something more open. I watched her become someone I had never fully seen before. A woman approached us with an easy smile, welcoming her without hesitation. Their interaction was natural, comfortable, filled with a kind of familiarity that spoke of time and trust. Evelyn introduced me with a brief pause, caught between roles she could no longer define as easily as before. The word she chose carried a quiet significance. Not assistant, not something distant or formal. Something closer, something undefined but meaningful. We moved through the space together, and I found myself observing her in a completely new way. The sharp edges that defined her in the office softened here, replaced by something warmer, something more human. When she spoke about why she had started coming here, her tone shifted again. It had begun after a difficult chapter in her life, a time when she needed something real, something grounding, something that existed beyond expectations and appearances. The mention of her past came without hesitation, but it carried weight. A brief marriage that hadn't lasted, shaped more by external expectations than genuine connection. The experience had left its mark, teaching her the cost of living a life defined by what others thought it should be. By the time we reached the computer lab, I felt like I was seeing her not in fragments, but as a whole person for the first time. The next 2 hours unfolded in a way I hadn't anticipated. I watched her work with patience and care, explaining concepts with clarity and encouragement, guiding someone through challenges without a trace of the intimidation she carried in the corporate world. She wasn't commanding here. She was supporting, investing herself fully in someone else's success. And without realizing it, I became part of it. I joined in, offering ideas, sketching out strategies, contributing in ways that felt natural and effortless. The dynamic between us shifted again, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by collaboration. We worked side by side. It felt right. When it was over, the person we had been helping looked at us with a kind of appreciation that made everything else fade into the background. The observation she made about us stayed with me, simple but undeniable. We worked well together. I glanced at Evelyn, and the way she looked back at me carried something deeper than agreement. There was pride there, admiration, and something unspoken that settled quietly between us. By the time we stepped outside again, the day had softened into evening. The sky glowed with fading light, casting everything in warm tones that made the moment feel almost suspended in time. She had a brief conversation with someone before returning to me, her expression thoughtful, as if she was still processing something she had been told. When she spoke, her honesty caught me off guard. She had been told she looked different, happier, and that difference had been noticed immediately. The reason she gave was simple. It was me. The words settled between us with quiet certainty. In that moment, standing in the soft light of the setting sun, she looked different in a way I couldn't fully describe. Not just beautiful, though she was that. Something more than that, real. Open in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. She told me she needed me to understand who she truly was beneath everything else, not just the version shaped by expectations and responsibility, but the one that existed when all of that fell away. A woman who cared deeply, who found meaning in small, quiet moments, who allowed herself to feel things she didn't always show. There was even a hint of self-conscious humor in the way she admitted to the softer parts of herself, the things she might have once considered weaknesses. To me, they felt like the opposite. They made her whole. I told her so without hesitation. Everything I had seen that day only deepened what I already felt. It didn't complicate things. It clarified them. She stepped closer, and I could see something fragile in her expression. Not weakness, but vulnerability, the kind that only appeared when someone chose to lower their guard. She spoke about the reality that came with it all. The past she carried, the habits she hadn't yet broken, the ways she sometimes lost herself in work, the imperfections she didn't try to hide. None of it changed anything for me. Everyone carried something. What mattered was who they chose to share it with. Time moved forward, quietly but steadily. Months later, life had reshaped itself in ways I hadn't expected but no longer questioned. The boundaries that once defined everything had shifted into something new, something intentional. Mornings became something to look forward to, a small ritual carved out of busy lives, a space where titles didn't matter, where the world outside could wait for just a little while. Those moments held a kind of simplicity that grounded everything else. The professional changes followed naturally. The transition had been deliberate, chosen not out of necessity but out of respect for what we were building. It mattered that what existed between us stood on its own, separate from expectations or assumptions. There had been challenges, whispers, speculation, quiet judgments that surfaced the moment something shifted, but they faded over time, replaced by something stronger. Results. Work that spoke clearly, leaving no room for doubt or dismissal. Success that couldn't be attributed to anything but effort and ability. And through it all, what we had remained steady. When Lena returned and sat across from me, her familiar presence felt like a bridge between who I had been and who I had become. She saw the difference immediately, the change written clearly in ways I no longer tried to hide. Happiness had a way of doing that. I admitted it without hesitation. Everything felt clearer now, more certain. The risks we had taken no longer felt like risks at all. They felt like necessary steps towards something real. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And that made all the difference. Lena leaned back in her seat with a knowing smile, her eyes bright with curiosity and affection. She spoke about finally meeting the woman who had so clearly changed my life, the one who had quietly taken over my thoughts and reshaped my future without ever intending to. I glanced at the time, feeling a small anticipatory flutter settle in my chest. The timing felt almost too perfect, as if the moment had arranged itself. Right on cue, the soft chime of the cafe door cut through the low hum of conversation, and I looked up instinctively. Evelyn stepped inside. Even after everything we had built over the past 6 months, the sight of her still had the power to steal the air from my lungs. She looked different from the version most people knew, dressed in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. This was the version of her I had come to cherish most, the one untouched by boardrooms and expectations, the one that belonged only to quiet mornings and stolen moments. Her eyes found mine immediately, and that smile appeared, soft and unmistakably hers, reserved in a way that made it feel intimate rather than distant. It was a look that still made my heart stumble, no matter how many times I had seen it. I stood to meet her, closing the distance between us with ease, greeting her with a brief kiss that felt natural now, something woven into the rhythm of my life. Then I turned, bridging the two worlds that had shaped me. Introductions followed, warm and effortless. Evelyn greeted Lena with a quiet confidence softened by genuine curiosity, and Lena responded with open approval, her easy charm filling the space between them. The conversation quickly turned to that moment months ago, the small, seemingly insignificant word that had shifted everything. Lena spoke about it lightly, but there was an undercurrent of truth in her words, a recognition of how something so simple had unraveled carefully built walls. Evelyn laughed, the sound warm and unguarded, still capable of sending a quiet rush of warmth through me. She admitted in her own way how determined she had once been to maintain distance, to keep everything contained within the boundaries she had always trusted. What changed had been simple. She glanced at me, and the softness in her expression said more than words ever could. It had been me, my persistence, my honesty, my refusal to let her hide behind the walls she had spent years building. The conversation flowed easily after that, filled with light teasing and shared stories. There was something deeply comforting in watching two important parts of my life come together so naturally, their differences fading in the face of something they both shared: care for me. Laughter came easily, especially when the topic shifted to small, everyday things. Evelyn revealed, with a hint of amusement, her early experience with my attempts at making coffee, and Lena's reaction was immediate. Delighted by the dynamic between us, the playful exchange felt effortless, grounded in familiarity and affection. Time slipped by almost unnoticed. When it was time for Lena to leave, her goodbye carried warmth and sincerity. She embraced us both, her usual lightness tempered by something more meaningful. Her words to Evelyn were simple but carried weight, a quiet request wrapped in trust. Evelyn's response came without hesitation, a promise, steady and certain. After Lena disappeared into the flow of the city, the energy shifted again, settling into something quieter. Evelyn and I chose to walk, letting the day stretch out around us. The air carried that unmistakable sense of possibility, the kind that made even ordinary moments feel significant. We moved side by side, hands intertwined, the world around us fading into the background. She spoke about Lena with genuine admiration, recognizing the bond we shared. There was no tension now, no trace of the uncertainty that had once surfaced in a single fleeting moment. What remained was something calmer, more assured. Still, there was a hint of something playful when she mentioned that particular word again, the one that had once unsettled her so deeply. This time it carried a different tone, lighter, almost possessive in a way that felt more affectionate than uncertain. The shift wasn't lost on me. In all the months we had been together, she had found her own ways of expressing affection, her own quiet language of closeness. Each word she used carried intention, chosen carefully, given meaning through the way she said it. That moment, standing there with her, felt like a continuation of something we had been building piece by piece. Then everything changed again. She stopped walking. The shift in her expression was immediate, the softness replaced by something more serious, more deliberate. There was a quiet weight in the air as she reached into her pocket, her movements steady but not entirely without tension. Time seemed to slow. When she spoke, her voice carried a depth of feeling that made everything else fade away. She spoke about the past months, about the way everything had shifted, about the walls she had once believed were necessary and the way they had fallen without her realizing it. She spoke about me, about what I had seen in her, about what I had given her the courage to become. The words settled into something real, something undeniable. When the small velvet box appeared, the world around us seemed to dissolve entirely. There was no room for anything else, no space for doubt or hesitation. Only the quiet certainty of the moment, the weight of everything that had led us here. Her hands trembled slightly, a rare and honest reflection of what she felt. For someone who had built her life on control, this moment stood as proof of everything she was willing to risk. She spoke about time, about how brief it had been and how irrelevant that felt in the face of what she knew. And then the question came. The word she chose carried history, emotion, and something deeply personal, something that tied the past to the present in a way that felt almost inevitable. Emotion rose too quickly to contain. The answer came just as easily. There was no hesitation, no second thought, only certainty. She placed the ring on my finger with care, and in the next moment, everything blurred into movement and emotion. The world rushed back and around us, voices and reactions blending into a distant background, but none of it mattered. What mattered was her. The way she held me, the way she laughed and cried at the same time, the way everything we had been building finally settled into something permanent. The words that followed came naturally. shaped by everything I felt but had never fully said. Love in all its forms, spoken without restraint. Her response carried the same weight, the same promise of something lasting. Later, when the noise of the world had faded and we found ourselves wrapped in the quiet comfort of her home, everything felt different. Not uncertain, not fragile. Certain, complete. We sat together, the reality of what had happened settling in slowly, the future stretching out in front of us in ways that felt both overwhelming and entirely right. The conversation turned to something lighter, a reflection on how everything had begun. The contrast between the simplicity of it and the depth of where it had led felt almost surreal. A single moment, a single word, something small enough to be dismissed, yet powerful enough to unravel everything and rebuild it into something new. The truth of it settled quietly. Love rarely followed logic or timing. It appeared where it wasn't expected, grew in places it shouldn't have, and transformed everything it touched. And sometimes, all it took was one word to change everything forever.